Right, hi everybody. Good morning, afternoon, or good evening. We are creeping inexorably towards the end of topic 3 here. And in this video, I want to begin topic 3.4, which is called conservation of biodiversity. Now, in my mind, it's another one of those subtopics where the IB throws a lot of different ideas at us in terms of content. I think there was a kind of obvious distinction that I can make, so I can make one video here and another to finish off. I think in this one I want to cover the need for conservation, the background, and the organisations involved in conservation. And then I'll do a second one where I talk about basically conservation strategies, or how we actually go about conserving natural ecosystems. I won't go over the things above my head because it's pretty obvious from the syllabus statements. So I've just cherry picked, like I said, the statements that are involved in the kind of background of conservation or the need for conservation. And I came up with 3 syllabus statements. Not many, you'll be pleased to see, in this one at least. Number 1, I want to cover the arguments for species and habitat preservation. You can see there that the IB tells us in terms of aesthetic, ecological, economic, ethical and social arguments, which I've put above my head again. Secondly, they ask us to consider the role of IGOs, GOs and NGOs in conservation strategies. Basically here I'll just cover the roles and we can evaluate maybe a bit more in the class the advantages and disadvantages of each type of organisation. Now I think we've done that before in to some extent, certainly when we talked a little bit about sustainable development. So I'll put some links when we talk about those organisations and international conventions. I'll put a link back to what we've already talked about in terms of sustainability. And then finally, I just want to introduce you to a few international conventions, basically 3. Again, we have mentioned some of these before, and maybe it's relevant to go back to what we've talked about before. But I do want to talk about, as you can see here, CITES, which is the Convention on the Trade of Endangered Species, or an international attempt to stop smuggling of wildlife, alive and dead. Then we can look at the WCS, which was the World Conservation Strategy, which was an international agreement reached in 1980, basically one of the earliest agreements on preserving biodiversity. And then we can look at the CBD, which was the Convention of Biological Diversity, which made up part of Agenda 21 of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, which again is something we've talked about fairly extensively when we covered sustainability. Okay. Before I go into my kind of spiel with the kind of content of this part of the course, I just thought it's worth asking you a few questions, and it might well be worth just pausing the video just to think about your own ideas here. This goes back to topic 1 we did a long time ago, where you consider your environmental value system. And that has a big role in how you see the role of conservation. So I want you to consider, I won't answer these specifically, but I want you to consider about your own position about these particular questions. Okay, number 1, do humans need to live with and amongst other species? And in what ways do we do that, or can we do that in the future? 2, do other species only exist in order to be exploited by human beings? I hope your answer to that is no. 3, do other species have a right to exist or be protected? Or in other words, do other species have bio rights? If your answer is yes, do some species have more bio rights than others? So for example, does a chimpanzee have more bio rights than a mosquito? And if so, why? 4, this is very TLK, but are your decisions based on reason, emotion, or both? Or other things, perhaps? And finally, number 5, are there reasons to conserve biodiversity or conversely not to conserve biodiversity? So if we're looking at this in class, I might just pause it there. If you're looking at it at home, maybe you want to just pause it and give some thought before you continue. Okay, but we will move on now. Okay, first of all, this is not really in the syllabus in any kind of form, but I think it's worth pointing out that you can consider conservation as opposed to preservation of ecosystems. Conservation biology is basically a very anthropocentric viewpoint. The idea that humans live within natural ecosystems and therefore have a right or perhaps a responsibility to look after those ecosystems and to manage them, often for human benefit. Another argument is a very ecocentric viewpoint that what humans should do is not conserve but preserve. In other words, keep humans away from protected ecosystems and don't allow humans to encroach. Again, you might want to consider what is your own environmental value system there before you continue. In this video, because it's basically what the IB syllabus sets out for us, we will be considering conservation biology as opposed to preservation. Okay, so going back to the syllabus statements, there are these 5 arguments in favour of conservation. So I just wanted to go through them fairly quickly and give you some food for thought. Actually, I've just realised I've put them in a slightly different order to the syllabus statements, but I don't think that matters. So first of all, we could consider the ethical arguments for conservation. This idea that living things have bio rights, that they have intrinsic value. Again, depending on your point of view, those bio rights might come from your religious beliefs or spiritual or cultural beliefs, because all of those things attach value to life, human and otherwise. And then another ethical argument might be that future generations, your children or grandchildren, surely have the same rights to enjoy the living world and to study the living world, we could say, as current generations alive today do. Economic arguments. Every species and ecosystem contributes to natural capital in some form, either as goods or services. Perhaps you could argue, successfully or not, that some species don't contribute to either of those things. We could say that many goods and services provided as part of natural capital provide natural income, and this can be turned into monetary profit, unfortunately very often for elite sections of society, but perhaps for all sections of society if we do it properly. So there is an economic value to, as we've talked before in topic 1, to natural capital. And then finally, the idea of ecotourism. Ecotourism is a huge industry now, particularly in LEDCs, because that's where so much natural capital and ecosystems, valuable ecosystems are. If we want a thriving ecotourism sector, then we need to conserve the ecosystems that people want to go and see. The aesthetic argument. Earth's living things are unique, and as far as we know, we live on the only planet with life in the universe. Perhaps that's not true, but that's what we know at the moment. The idea that being surrounded by living things gives life meaning and makes life more pleasurable, gives life beauty. And then finally, that all species add in some form to the quality of human existence and experience. I wouldn't like my child to grow up in a world of concrete. I'd like it to grow up in a world where there is availability of ecosystems to see, to study and be part of. Okay, and the ecological. All species, this links back to the previous video, by the way. All species provide some form of balance to the ecosystem they're part of, because they occupy a niche within that ecosystem. Some species are keystone species. We've talked about that before in terms of, well, the case study we looked at was the sea otter in the Californian kelp forest. You take away one particular keystone species and the whole ecosystem is liable to collapse. Very often we don't recognise a keystone species unless its removal causes the ecosystem to collapse. And that was certainly the case with the sea otter in the Californian kelp forests. And then a direct link back to the last video, actually, topic 3.3. All species add to diversity, inertia, and resilience of an ecosystem. So therefore, we have a responsibility to conserve all species, because without them, we could be condemning an ecosystem to destruction. Or at least we're reducing its diversity, inertia, and resilience, increasing the likelihood a collapse could occur, and decreasing the ability of an ecosystem to bounce back from an event where biodiversity is impacted. In other words, all species have a role to play in protecting ecosystems from external change, very often caused by humans, of course. Okay, hope that was okay, and you could maybe think about that a bit more. Obviously, when we go through things like this, we're kind of adding to knowledge that's going to help us to write specifically one of the essay questions in paper 2. Okay, let's move on to the next part then. So the next part on my keywords above my head here is the role of NGOs, IGOs, and GOs. Again, possibly repetitive because it is something we talked about as part of topic 1 a long time ago. Okay, so let's just cover what are IGOs, NGOs, and GOs. An NGO is a non-governmental organisation, for example, Greenpeace or the Worldwide Fund for Nature. I'm sure you can think of many others. They are not run or funded by national governments. They are independent of governments and independent of IGOs like the United Nations. So therefore, I guess the weakness they have is they're not directly influential as part of national policy or international policy. As we'll see on the next slide, they can use the power in other ways to influence GOs and IGOs. IGOs are intergovernmental organisations. Obviously, any part of the United Nations is an IGO. For example, UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Programme, or UNESCO. The IUCN is not part of the United Nations, but is another example of an IGO. These are all basically organisations that international governments sign up to be a part of. That obviously gives them some strength in terms of being part of the international community and actually having direct influence on government organisations. But as we've seen many, many times before, especially in terms of the United Nations, sometimes that's a double-edged sword because IGOs sometimes have a lot of difficulty in imposing international agreements, even ones that have been signed up to and been ratified by nearly every government on earth. So I've said here, they're established by international agreements. They have some influence over national governments, but conversely, they're also influenced by national politics as well. And there is this problem of who actually enforces conventions made by IGOs. And the answer is nobody. And then finally, GOs, or government organisations. In terms of what we talk about in environmental systems, these are national departments of the environment or national environment agencies. Some are more powerful than others. They can only do what's granted to them to be able to do by international governments, and they can be affected by national policy and also defunded or weakened by national policy. So I've said here they are restricted by national politics, but they can be very important in bringing international conventions to bear in individual governments and enforcing national policies in terms of the environment. Okay, I've got another couple of slides. The next one I could foresee you being asked in an essay question to evaluate or compare and contrast certainly IGOs and GOs. So I made this little table as basically food for thought for you. I'm sure you can add to it. Okay, first of all, media. In terms of IGOs have a lot of money available to them from governments around the world. They can be very professional organisations with very professional people working for them, very slick, access to international media, for example, and news releases, press releases. Whereas NGOs are funded by local people, sometimes on a large scale, but nevertheless they are basically funded by individual people. And therefore they kind of become more dependent on public events, public protests, and very often publicity stunts. Now, again, this is another double-edged sword. I remember very specifically one event that put me off Greenpeace quite a lot at the time. I don't know if you remember it. In 2014, there was a United Nations meeting on the environment in Lima, Peru, and Greenpeace decided, as part of a publicity stunt, they would unveil banners, protest banners, across the Nazca lines in Peru, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You probably know these images made in the rock face in Peru of animals, monkeys, hummingbirds. And basically they unveil this banner across the site where it's very, very difficult to get access because it's such a protected site. They damaged the site, they trampled part of the site, they caused a lot of offence politically, but also culturally to the indigenous people of Peru. And ultimately, it was a real problem for Greenpeace to recover from the bad publicity that caused. So these publicity stunts can be like I said, effective, but also very problematic. Okay, in terms of response, I've already said that the response of IGOs can be slow, but also very ineffective if it doesn't have the agreement of governments to go forward. Opposite to that, NGOs can count on rapid and regular responses from local people, and they're able to make their own decisions independently of international politics and international government. The constraints: IGOs are very constrained by legal requirements and diplomacy, whereas NGOs can do their own thing. They're generally unaffected by international politics. Again, but the downside of that is that some of their activities can therefore be seen as illegal, or very often are illegal, as we saw with my example of Greenpeace and the protest on the Nazca lines in Peru. Political influence: huge political influence on IGOs and no direct influence on NGOs. That's a real strength of NGOs. They can basically speak to people directly without the need for international diplomacy or international politics. The strength of NGOs lie in changing public perception, and therefore, at least in democratic countries, affecting the way that people might vote for the government of the day. And then finally, enforceability. IGOs, well, one good thing is that they can be enforced as part of law. But again, to risk repeating myself for the millionth time, the bad thing can be the lack of any kind of direct enforcement to make governments actually respect the things they might have agreed to. Whereas NGOs, they kind of don't work within national or international politics, so therefore they have to be reliant on public pressure and the need for people to protest, public protest, and the pressure that people can put on their own government. Okay, we can discuss that a little bit more in the classroom, I think, and I'm sure you can add to what I've kind of come up with. Right, then my final slide, and I thought this was a good place to just finish and then lead up to a second video where we'll look at conservation strategies. These are the three main international conventions on conservation of biodiversity that I came up with. The first of these is CITES, first put into practice in 1973, and it was driven by the IUCN, which I've already described to you as a IGO. Obviously, we've already talked about the IUCN in terms of its publication, its yearly publication of the Red List of Endangered Species. What can I say about this? It aimed, or still aims, to prevent smuggling of endangered species. That includes live species and dead. There's a huge trade today around the world for bushmeat. Uh, Very difficult this because a lot of cultures see consumption of bushmeat as being integral to their culture and something that and their traditions that should be preserved. Nevertheless, in a lot of cases, it is illegal to smuggle bushmeat. The strength of CITES is it's, like I said before, it's enshrined in international law. So therefore, it is relatively easy to prosecute smugglers wherever this trade occurs. And it's a good way to actually fight international organised crime. The smuggling of species is a huge industry, unfortunately, at the moment. However, unfortunately, non-compliance in a lot of countries is rife. In a lot of countries, officials, ports, airports, and even in government can be bought off. It's voluntary, so governments have the right to buy into CITES or not to. And unfortunately, there's very little international funding to support it. It's down to each individual country to invest in stopping smuggling. And unfortunately, a lot of countries don't see it as a priority, or at least don't see it as a priority for funding, despite the fact that it's 40 something years old now, 1973. Number two, the World Conservation Strategy. This was set up in 1980, and this is a good example actually of IGOs and GOs coming together. You can see that I've written there it's a collaboration of IGOs, the IUCN, and UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, but it also involved the WWF, the World Wide Fund for Nature, which is a GO. So it was an international agreement, a very early one, with the aim of maintaining ecosystems, preserve genetic diversity, and basically promote sustainable development. Promote sustainable use of species and ecosystems. You could argue it was a precursor to a lot of the agreements that came after, like, for example, the Rio Summit that I'll talk about next. Not that successful, I would argue, the WCS. And then finally, the CBD, which was the Convention on Biological Diversity, which made up part of Agenda 21 at the first 1992 Rio Earth Summit. This was kind of a direct successor from the Brundtland Commission, which came up with the definition of sustainable development. And at its basis, it was just an agreement for governments to try to promote biodiversity. Now, I won't go on about that because, again, the Rio Earth Summit and Agenda 21 is something that we covered in some detail previously. So I just don't want to repeat what we talked about before. Basically, it's just putting biodiversity in the context of sustainable development. Okay, I hope that was followable, if that's the word. I hope it made sense. Take care of yourselves, and we'll discuss this a bit further in the classroom. Okay, bye everybody.